All right, hello everyone that's watching. My name is Sean. This has been something I've been thinking about for a little while, and sort of like doing chats about movies and chats about TV and pop culture and whatnot. Also like getting out and riding the bike. And here in Melbourne, we've just obviously sort of hit or come into spring. Weather's a little bit nicer. It was hard to get myself G'd up enough to get out and do much of this. In the winter, it's freezing, it's windy, it's wet. It's not very good. But now that the weather's a little bit nicer, it sort of came to me the other day that maybe I could sort of think about doing something like this. I had some action cameras and how to frame it. Basically, I'll go for a ride. I'll have a chat about something. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. Hopefully you'll get something out of it. And as a bit of a strange twist, you'll also be able to see where I'm going, where I'm riding. It's probably a bad idea. It probably doesn't work at all, but it's basically a pilot. It's such a fresh idea. This guy's just whippersnippering there. Hopefully I don't get some shrapnel. It's actually such a fresh idea that I don't really even have a name for it. That's a work in progress. We'll have to think about something in the coming days and weeks, if indeed I keep doing this. But what sort of finally spurred me into action to get on the bike, tick the legs over, go for a ride, twofold, as I said, weather, nice. It's always a plus. Always a lot easier to get out on the bike when it's a bit like this. And then secondly, the other day, we're Saturday today. So on Friday morning for us, I woke up and was scrolling through Twitter and wasn't expecting it. I hadn't seen anything about it coming out. Lionsgate dropped the first trailer for it's the first cinematic John Wick spin-off. There have been some little John Wick spin-offs in the past. It's obviously The Continental, which was a limited run TV show. I think they had 3 episodes of that, sort of like a limited series. There was I suppose it's not really a spin-off. There was a game called Jonah Hex. It certainly wasn't a Jonah Hex game. It was a John Wick game called Hex. Jonah Hex. It's not a good movie. Although, an interesting character. I'll probably get distracted like this a fair bit as we go. There was a wonderful episode of Batman the Animated Series many, many years ago. I think I just got semi-swooped. We might have had some vision of that from behind. There was a wonderful episode of Batman the Animated Series many, many years ago, which was told, it was like a flashback. And the idea was Batman and Robin were pursuing Ra's al Ghul. And as they got to the first location and, what's happening? We're going to try to track him down. Ra's al Ghul had left him. It was a recording of something. It actually might have been a cassette. Batman the Animated Series had that wonderful dark deco sort of anachronistic aesthetic where it was set in the 30s, or it was stylized to present as though it was sort of the 30s, this classic Warner Brothers detective art deco type stuff. But they had like TVs and like computers and whatnot, so it was sort of a fun aesthetic. But Ra's al Ghul gave him maybe a long play cassette, and as Batman and Robin pursued his goons to the airfield, they listened to this cassette, and the episode played out in this really fun sort of flashback narrative telling the story about why Ra's al Ghul was interested in, quote, kidnapping this particular person. And I won't give the plot away if you're interested in watching the episode, but it's really, really well done, and it's brilliant, and it features Jonah Hex because it takes place back in the Old West. So I didn't expect to talk about Jonah Hex, but there we are. But yeah, there was a John Wick video game called Hex. But Ballerina is effectively, it's the first spin-off made for the big screen out of the John Wick sort of universe, the John Wick world. And actually just on John Wick games, why isn't there like a John Wick VR? Why isn't there like a John Wick Time Crisis? It seems like the most obvious video game to come out of this particular property, and particularly with the way technology is now, like a PlayStation VR John Wick shoot 'em up game. Seems like the most obvious thing for any of those developers to make, really. You're just a John Wick point of view shooter where you're actually performing Yeah, bizarre. Anyway, that's a conversation for another time. The reason I sort of wanted to talk about Ballerina is there's a couple of aspects to it. One, it's a film I'm sort of looking forward to, coming from the John Wick universe, which has been really well put together now for quite a few years. It's sort of an interesting positioning for that franchise because for those of you watching who have seen those John Wick films, there was quite a full stop put on that series at the end of John Wick 4. So where do they take it? Do they just mothball it? Is that the end? It always seemed like something that they'd built so brilliantly, it would be a real shame were that to be the end of it. And so it's turned out. This is one for the books. You don't usually get across this intersection first go. And but you know, it seemed like such a property, or a property rather, that is so rich and so vast and dense with so much fantastic lore that it would be a shame if John Wick 4 was to be the end of it. It does seem like something that could easily, and hopefully has easily, been transported or translated into other media, expanded worlds, more characters, new adventures, you know, etc., etc. So in the case of a film like Ballerina, it had sort of interested me, it being that it existed in a film property or within a film franchise that I was a fan of, and then interested me from the perspective of, well, what do they do with it? Where do they take it? How do they sort of relaunch it, if you will? How do they start it now down this fresh or new path? And then secondly, again, this film was shot in 2022, I think, from memory. I remember seeing the news about it going into production prior to the release of John Wick 4. John Wick 4, of course, came out, if memory serves, in the first quarter of 2023. But this film went into production in 2022, was meant to come out mid-2024. Obviously that's come and gone, didn't happen. We've only just got a trailer for it. And I think now the release date is scheduled for sort of June of 2025. We'll get into all that later, I suppose. But just in terms of, you know, it's been delayed, we've been waiting for it. Here's a first look at it. What does it mean? What does it look like? Where could it go? Just sort of wanted to talk about all that, first impressions of the trailer, and more broadly speaking, a conversation about John Wick as a franchise, where it came from, what it did well. So I hope you like that. Before we kick on, of course, if we do kick on and keep on doing these, make sure you like and subscribe. It's all very, very important. It's awkward to shill, it's awkward to beg, but that's the way it goes. And do comment as well if you've liked the series, or have a comment to make on anything I've said, or have a question, or have a clarification if I ask a question, have a correction, because I'll make lots of errors as I'm riding around. But that'd be really great if you could like and subscribe and follow the page. If I do continue to make these videos, that would be really, really helpful and really, really much appreciated. The film itself, Ballerina, directed by Len Wiseman, who was an interesting choice because people who, you know, familiar with cinema might be familiar with the name. He's got a bit of form in this space. He directed the first two Underworld movies way back when, starring Kate Beckinsale, who I think he actually might have married at one point. Actually hasn't made a film since 2012's Total Recall. You know, the Colin Farrell, the reboot, just didn't quite work, did it? And this is the first film that Len Wiseman has directed since, which, for a guy that was working relatively... which way do I want to go here? That's a good question. I'll go this way. For a guy that had done a lot of stuff in the preceding sort of decade, little bits and pieces, wasn't ridiculously prolific, but was a working director. It's fascinating that he hasn't done anything since 2012. The film was written by a guy named Shay Hatton. Shay Hatton wrote John Wick 3 and 4. I always like that. I always like when there's some connective DNA, if we want to call it that, between property or within properties, between spin-offs and between film projects. Shay's obviously worked, as we said, on the last two John Wick films, which were... The second one really started it, which was great. The first one did a wonderful job of setting things up. The second one, it grew and expanded the lore. And then the third and fourth ones have really taken that to the next level. The director of the first, or the four, I was going to say the first four, there are only four. the director of the 4 John Wick films, former stuntman, sort of stunt coordinator on the Matrix films, Chad Stahelski. He is not obviously directing, Len Wiseman is, but it's great to see he's on board as a producer. And then more interestingly, in kind of digging what had happened with this film in development, as we said, shot back in 2022, Stahelski had come on board, or come into the edit, I suppose, and was overseeing the way the rough cut was coming together and the way that the film was being put together in post. And with Lionsgate and with Len Wiseman, had basically determined that they needed to do some reshoots. Now, reshoots have become a bit of a dirty word in film. I think it's been misrepresented as a sign of things being bad or things being wrong or things being unsalvageable. And I think what we've got to do is sort of just reset our own understandings of our expectations of what do, I've misrepresented which gear I need to be in as I go up this hill, which has caused some problems. What a reshoot does, and has always done, pickups, is allow you to go back and fix little issues, a dialogue, some exposition stuff, some plot stuff, some motivation stuff, clean up some action. As you can well imagine, putting a film together would be like putting a puzzle together, and imagine you're putting it together and you realise you're missing a piece. Well, a pickup's all about putting that film together and then recognising what you do have, what you don't have, what you need to go and get, and then going and getting it. The problem in modern times, I think, is perceived by some people within the film community, is that 35 years ago, maybe even 25 years ago, the whole process of reshooting something was quite arduous. You have to rebuild sets, whether it be locations or the like. So what you could do was relatively limited. Whereas nowadays, with stuff like the volume, which Disney use, just green screen in general, special effects in general, it's a lot easier to go back and redo large chunks. Now, I understand that could be a bad thing, because you could maybe be drawn to wanting to fix or feeling like you can fix more than you maybe need to. But in the case of Ballerina, what it sounds like is they put the film together, and I think they've made a right call in the sense that Chad Stahelski's looked at it and said, we're making a John Wick film, and with that comes certain expectations regarding action and spectacle set pieces, and these just aren't quite where they need to be. So what they've done is spend some early parts of this year, I believe it is, reshooting, rejigging, reworking quite a lot of those scenes to make sure that when the film is released, it is, or can meet, can exceed expectations, because the spectacle has become bigger, the set pieces have become more intricate. That's, I suppose, the cost of escalation. As you make these films, things have to keep getting bigger and bigger, and there comes a time ultimately, this guy's going to let me through, give him a wave. There comes a time ultimately where you can only go so big, you can only go so grand, you sort of hit the ceiling. But the worst thing for Ballerina would be to come out and be lesser than, because then all of a sudden the comparisons are very obvious, very easy to make to the films which have preceded it in its own franchise. If it is less than, if it is not as good as, not as exciting as, then immediately for the audience you need to sell the film, that's a problem. The fact that it was shot so long ago too, it was jarring initially to see Lance Reddick, who plays the character of Chiron, who's sort of the concierge at the Continental, the hotel, which is very much at the heart of the John Wick film series. Lance Reddick very sadly passed away last year, I think it was sort of March of last year, around the release of the fourth movie actually. But yeah, very, very sadly, no longer with us. And obviously the reason that he's in the film is because it was shot before that. So some people might have seen that, and if they're familiar with the situation with Lance and his death, might have thought there was some of that digital necromancy that we're seeing a little bit more of with a Peter Cushing. That's been in the news again lately, in his likeness being used in Rogue One. Ian Holm, of course, his likeness was used in Alien Romulus, which is good to see because he was such a good part of those films, and he and Ian McShane and Keanu Reeves really did a lot of heavy lifting and did a lot of really good work to get the film series where it is and get the film series to a point where it's enjoyed by so many people. But look, the logline is pretty basic. Ana de Armas obviously takes up the lead role now as the protagonist in this series, the titular ballerina, I suppose. And the logline is a fairly straightforward one. A young assassin seeks revenge against the people who killed her family. That's as good a reason as any to want revenge, I suppose. Interestingly, as I said, the film sort of takes place running alongside or within the events of John Wick 3. We see a little Back to the Future style, Back to the Future 2 style stuff where they cross over. We see the scene in which John Wick visits Rusta Roma, the Tarkovsky Theatre in New York, and meets Angelica Houston's character, the director, who is obviously responsible for the training of the ballerinas at this. It's an assassin school. That's really all it is. It's an assassin TAFE course. But we see the events of that and that meeting, a little element of it from her perspective when Wick visits, which again is sort of interesting. And I mentioned it earlier. It's a little bit Back to the Future 2-y. And I suppose the involvement of some of those characters, whether it be John Wick himself, you can't launch a spin-off to John Wick without acknowledging that character. I think there is an expectation of, if you're making a film that is set in this world, that you need to give audiences some sort of fan service. You need to give audiences and that character some legitimacy, really, by involving them. Oh, this is some gravel. I wasn't expecting this. I don't know about this. I don't know what this footage is going to look like. This is yuck. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Here we go. That's better. I feel a bit like Charlie Borman and Ewan McGregor when they'd be riding through Far East Asia or whether it's Eastern Russia, and after however many days and weeks just on dirt tracks and loose gravel and whatever, they come across some bitumen. I mean, I was only on it for 2 or 3 minutes, but I feel like I understand where they're coming from. You've got to have these cameos, you've got to have these recurring characters feature if you can, and do so in a way that services the plot, isn't a distraction. If you can have them be reintroduced to help our new character find her footing and establish herself in the world, of course it's a tip of the hat and a nod of the head to the audience, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. And as the series continues to evolve, if Ballerina is successful in its own right and successful enough to warrant a sequel, I think you will see maybe less of those recurring elements, but just as a starting point, you've got to have those guys come in and show their face, basically. But at the end of the day, what has become very apparent with these films as they've grown and as they've continued to evolve, as they've continued to develop, is they live and die basically on the strength of the spectacle, the strength of the action, the strength of those set pieces. How do we get to them? How are they executed? How are they delivered? And that goes an awfully long way towards, casting these films as a success or a failure. How creative they can get in this space sort of dictates how exciting they are, how entertaining they are as a spectacle. There is a lot of style to them, which is commendable, and something that has, like the film series itself, grown over time, and they've kind of got this fun sort of neon, sort of cyberpunky aesthetic, I suppose, which is visually very arresting and entertaining. But when you're making an action film, the film is only as good as the action in the film. So the success of this film will really come down to her charisma and how compelling she can be as an action leading lady. From the small glimpse we've got of her as Paloma in No Time to Die, I think we can be realistically confident that she has the ability and the chops to do it, but we wait and see. And then the other thing that sort of doesn't, is a man playing a saxophone. I think he's practicing, he's hopefully getting better, aren't we all? But the other thing that I think, a lot of the time guides these sort of films, while we're still on the topic of James Bond, it just twigged me to that, is realistically these films are, as well, I say realistically a lot, these films are travel logs. And what you get when you go to the cinema to watch a James Bond movie, to watch a John Wick movie, is this sort of globe-trotting adventure. And maybe that's a problem with James Bond. James Bond is sort of, when it burst onto the scene, the first film, obviously Dr. No was made, released in 1962. And he went to the Nassau, he went out to the Bahamas, which I think at the time was just an excuse for, you notice a lot of those early Bond films, they probably shot in European winters. So the production would always go, not always, there are obviously outliers, but would regularly go to warm weather shooting locations in a tropical climate on the other side of the world. I can't help but think it was just an excuse to basically go on holiday and shoot a movie while they're there. It's something Adam Sandler's done a bit of lately. There's a lot of Adam Sandler's films that take place at what effectively amounts to a holiday resort in the summer, and it just feels like he's on holiday, basically. But what Bond films were globe-trotting, world-spanning travel logs, and they would take you, if you think in the 60s, yeah, the Bahamas, yeah, okay. And then you're From Russia with Love, like they go to Turkey, they go into like Eastern Europe, which had largely been closed off. Oh, we've got some echo as we come through the tunnel, but which had largely been closed off, obviously, to the Western world in the aftermath of World War II and the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Union, etc. But they would take you, like even something as simple in Goldfinger. I remember Dad saying, they went to America and they went to Kentucky, and you look at that sequence now and you're like, why? I don't know why is this exciting. But he goes, something as simple as Felix Leiter was sitting in his car at one point eating KFC. And that's something that doesn't seem important or interesting in 2024, but in 1964, it was a bit of a quirky curiosity. It was a bit of a gimmick. And when you're sitting in the cinema, wherever you are, there's a fair chance the film is taking you somewhere you aren't. And that's the beauty of storytelling. It's to take you wherever you can't go, aren't, want to go, etc. It's always very, very interesting in that regard. And in this particular film, it looks like we've got a little bit of that. There's a few locations they reveal in the trailer which do look different and visually exciting and new. I suppose the excitement, or the reason I kind of wanted to talk about this, just doubling back around, I might have mentioned it off the top. I've forgotten what I've said largely already. So if I'm repeating myself, we'll just chalk that down to fatigue. But I just think it's a really sensible direction to take the series in. I mentioned earlier, I do remember this much, that I kind of said, you don't really want to, there's no point, or there'd be no justice in sort of letting this John Wick series and the wonderful world that they built from the ground up die with the character of John Wick. It's so big and it's so vast and it's so old. There's been so many wonderful additions to the film series which speak to this subculture within the world that these characters exist and live in that is so old and so ripe for expansion and exploration. And the best way to do that's a spin-off, and the best way to do that is by introducing a character from, the Ruska Roma in this case, which they introduced in John Wick 3, as something that we know a little bit about, but as something that they can flesh out and explain and explore more of. And as somebody who's been really enjoying these films and where they've been going and where they've taken us, I just think it's such an obvious thing to do. It's such a smart thing to do, to keep the wheel going, to keep everything ticking over, to keep bringing audiences back to this world. John Wick's death shouldn't be the end of films being made in this world. He is just one character in this environment. He is just one character that exists in this very, very dense landscape. And the fact that we can go back and revisit it and see more, I think he's good. I think he's ripe for some really compelling, interesting, entertaining cinema. So fingers crossed that's what they're going to serve us up when the film is released in the middle of next year. I suppose now that I've done that thing again, I'm stuck on the hill, I'm in too high of a gear. What I love about the series is largely what it represents. And it's sort of like a very old school consequence of the way the market used to be and the various layers of the market and how it used to exist. You'd have the film release and then, 4+5 months later, there would be secondary market. There'd be DVD, obviously VHS back in the day. And I do wonder, and I could be wrong about this, but it feels like John Wick, which was released in 2014, is sort of the last great example of a film which got a second life on home video. came out, did about $90 million worldwide. It was like high 80s worldwide at the box office off like a $20 million budget, which is good going, like 100%. That is good going. No one lost money on that first John Wick film. Art is not probably the number one priority when making films. It's to not go bankrupt. But in making that film, it went all right at the cinema, but where it really went well was the secondary market. And people who hadn't seen it at the cinema, people who weren't familiar with it from its cinema release, its theatrical run, caught up with it on DVD, caught up with it sitting on the couch at home, and really enjoyed it. And it ended up making a whole bunch more money in the back end, which again made the film more profitable and created a bit of a clamour for another one. And what is so interesting about this is the second one, and it is, oh, where do I want to go now? I think I want to go straight ahead and then left. But what is interesting about it from like an Australian perspective, if people remember back in 2017 when John Wick 2 was released, it actually didn't have a theatrical release window in Australia. Some marketing stuff came out about it, some trailers came out about it, and a US date was set, and probably in some bigger markets as well, like hopefully this wind isn't too bad for you guys, and some bigger markets like the UK, they all had dates, but in Australia there was none. It wasn't like it comes out in September in the US and we'll get it in October. There was no date. No one in Australia had picked it up for distribution, whether it be Lionsgate or someone else, because no one really knew about it. No one cared about it. It was this film that had Keanu Reeves in it, where he's an assassin, and the last one had sort of gone okay, but and it wasn't until there was a bit of a groundswell of online sort of noise about it that it was picked up. It would have been eventually, don't get me wrong, like they wouldn't have shunted it straight to video in Australia. It would have eventually got a release. But it would have been a really, really old school model of, the film comes out in September in the US and then eventually makes its way to Australia in January. But in this case, the film had created or had won itself such an audience on home video the first time around that news of a sequel spread, and then confusion spread as to why there was no release date in this market. So like, let's be fair, John Wick is, part of its success is Keanu, and part of that is because while we all love Keanu, we all recognise that he's not a very good actor. And the fact that he has been so successful and the fact that he is so loved is sort of testament to just who he is and the way he carries himself and how genuine he seems to be. But John Wick really succeeds because it plays into Keanu's strengths. He is not a good actor. So don't have him delivering thick slabs of dialogue that go from one page to the next, play into his physicality, and then when he does talk, there is importance, there is weight to them. It's a bit like the old school Arnold Schwarzenegger, Terminator vibe. He barely speaks. He's the title character of the film, but he barely speaks. Therefore, when he does speak, you listen, because it's not, or it shouldn't be, just a throwaway line. I mean, it turned what are his limitations into a strength, which is one of, not the only, but one of the reasons that these films have been so successful, because we all like Keanu. We just don't really want to see him acting. Think Dracula. If you haven't seen that, don't. So in the end, John Wick 2, bearing in mind the first one did, let's round it up, let's say it did $90 million, the first one at the worldwide box office. John Wick 2 comes out in 2017. Done $171 million. The budget would have been a little, I don't have the budget on hand, but the budget would have been a little bit more. That is an enormous bump. That is absolutely magnificent. And what I would fully expect exceeded the wildest expectations of Lionsgate and the film's producers and all that. It was wonderful. What does that mean? We're going to make a third one. So we make a third one. The third one did $327 million worldwide. Well, that's a big success. That's an even bigger success than the second one. We've got to make a fourth one. We do. $440 million worldwide. that is a wonderful endorsement and advertisement for what Lionsgate and Chad Stahelski and Keanu Reeves and Shay Hatter and everyone involved in John Wick, all the principal, creative involved in John Wick. It's a wonderful example and a wonderful endorsement of what they've been able to build, because there are exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking in cinema, generally speaking with anything like this, there is that law of diminishing returns, where you think about even Star Wars comes out in 1977 and the market is a little bit different with re-releases, and there's no home video and there's no cable television, and a hit film was sort of the only thing in town and all that stuff. I get it. But that film comes out in 1977 and it is the biggest film ever made. It is the biggest film of all time. Naturally, like John Wick, we've got to make a sequel. So we make a sequel, The Empire Strikes Back. The Empire Strikes Back is a bigger movie, it costs more to make, it is a better movie. And it made, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it made like 75% of the final gross of Star Wars. And then Return of the Jedi was, I think, a little bit less again. But these are three much loved, revered, some of the biggest films of all time. And there's that diminishing, law of diminishing returns. So the fact that John Wick has bucked that, there are exceptions. Some of those Marvel films obviously grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, and their box offices reflect that. There are examples in which films have gained momentum and the grosses have continued to grow. And then the other thing I love about it too, just as a series and what it represents, coming out in 2014, which was very much, we're 6 years now, or at that point, we're 6 years into the MCU, the all-conquering MCU. And this little film, John Wick, came out, cost $20 million, and has spawned 3 sequels and now a spin-off. And it was brand new. It was brand spanking new. It wasn't based on anything else. It wasn't based on this. It wasn't based on an existing property. It wasn't lifted as from an old TV show or a video game, or it wasn't adapted from anything. And I love that the fact that they've grown in the era of the IP, in the era of the cinematic universe. It's become, ironically, it's become that. But they've grown this thing from nothing. And I think that's worth applauding. As I said, the irony is now it's spawning sequels and spin-offs and all that kind of stuff. But I think it really earned the right to do that, because they built it from scratch. They built it from the ground up, and rightly deserve the plaudits and the profits and all that come with that, I think. So just in talking about John Wick and why this film, interests me so much, I've got to give, and I have already done, oh no, it's gravel again. Oh no, it's a branch. Oh, it's uncomfortable. Might need to write to the council about that 30-metre stretch of gravel, which then goes back onto a paved path. But the thing I've loved about this film series, and the reason I want it to continue, as I've said before, is just the world. The world is so good. And I'm going to make a really strange comparison here, but the strength of John Wick is largely rooted in that world that the character inhabits, and how interesting and how enveloping it is and how well done it is. Because in the first film, the whole thing is sort of like this abstract, fun curiosity without a lot of explanation. Everything that is presented, from the gold coins that are obviously used as the currency, from the customs, from the cleanup crew that come to John's house after he engages with that initial batch of hitmen, it's just taken for granted. It just is what it is. And the characters within the world just recognize it is what it is. We live in this strange setup, this strange place, and we just deal with the guards, gravel again. Back on. It's really good that the way it's presented is so earnest and so straight-faced, and that's a big reason why it works as well as it does. And I think if you look back, you sort of see that the first film is this relatively small, relatively constrained storyline, or plot. It's this relatively small world within the bigger world, and it's excellent and it's so well done. Oh, I'm in the wrong gear again. It's very, very easy to follow that first one. It's very simple in the fact that man A is pursuing X and Y for reasons 1 and 2, and it's just brilliantly well done. And then what it's grown into in terms of taking us to every corner of, not every corner, but so many corners, it's painted in the edges, giving us more meat on the bone, and taken us to so many more interesting places within that guy's world. Initially, the little snapshot we get, as we said, is relatively contained. And then from that point, to look back on now and reflect on how big it is absolutely fantastic. And the way they revealed so many new characters, so many new friends, foes, places, customs, cultures, etc. Has been just so wonderful. And the strange comparison I'm going to make is Zoolander. So if you think about watching that first Zoolander, the second one, not good. But if you watch that first Zoolander film, it's very similar in that it presents all the curiosities and quirks of this character's world with a completely straight face. And it presents them in a manner which reveals more and more about the character and more about the world as they go. But it just reveals so brilliantly so much about this crazy world that Derek and his male model friends live in. And everyone who interacts within that world does so. We've got the character, played by his wife, obviously, and she's the audience avatar in this case that takes us into his crazy world, which again is just a really good storytelling beat. But everything within it, and the way he carries on, the way he acts, the way the world interacts with him, the walk-off, the idea that the fashion industry is controlling the geopolitical landscape of the world. And it's just everything in it's a given because it's been operating like that to its inhabitants for so long. And I think John Wick is something that they didn't necessarily take Zoolander or use Zoolander as inspiration. But I think in the same sort of way, it's the way it all plays out, the way it's all built, the way everyone interacts within the world, the way everyone is comfortable with how that world is run and the rules of that world. It's just brilliant. And it's a true testament to everyone involved. I've said that ad nauseum, I'm repeating myself, I know that. In the case of John Wick, there are so many wonderful examples in all of these films of the characters within these worlds living by, abiding by, being constrained by, respecting, acknowledging the various laws, rules, regulations that these films are either building on, developing or expanding, explaining. So many, there's heaps of them. The tailor, the armourer, I think Peter Serafinowicz played the like a sommelier with all the guns and stuff. But all that kind of stuff's really good and brilliant fun. But an example that I've always gone back to when I think about how effective and how well done the John Wick series sort of handles all this stuff. There's this great sequence in the second film where John Wick goes to Italy, and the reason he goes to Italy is because Santino D'Antonio, who's a sort of a friend, not a friend, an acquaintance of John, who they had an agreement with. They had this sort of blood pact with each other. Again, that's an element of the series that gets explained, and the political ramifications of that get explained. But he has this pact where he has to do something for Santino if he requests that he do it to settle and square off a debt sort of thing. And what Santino asks him to do, and what John Wick can't refuse to do, is kill his sister Gianna. And anyway, he goes and he confronts Gianna, and she knows what's happening. They both know what's happening. She ends up taking her own life, so to spare in a way John Wick the guilt of having to do it. As he's leaving, he comes across the character of Cassian, played by Common, who's Gianna's, hit bodyguards, And they have this really sort of fascinating, really wonderful exchange just as they go up a very steep hill, which is exhausting. So they come across each other and say hello or whatever, and Cassian asks, "Are you working? Are you here on business?" And they're at like a rave, and John says, "Yeah, are you?" And Cassian says, "Yeah." And then he sort of pauses, has this really good beat, and says, "Good night." And John just shoots back this really forlorn, really kind of nice. I said earlier that Keanu can't act. Well, within his limitations, he can deliver the line here or there that works, and that's why this film works for him. So Cassian asks, was it a good night? Were you successful? And John just shoots back, "Afraid so." And in that moment, they both know, it's a shame to hear. Cassian says something like, "I'm sorry to hear that," or it's, and then they draw their guns, they start shooting, and then it's on. And then what we get after that, is this fantastic shootout in the catacombs, and really the scene that kind of helped the franchise break containment. It was this unbelievable action sequence, action set piece, and set to an incredible piece of music called John Wick Mode. There's civility and there's decorum and there's respect within the world. and between the people that inhabit it, and in this strange, quirky sort of way, a little bit Godfather-y. They sort of know it's not personal. They sort of know what's happening here. It's not about me not liking you or hating you or whatever. It's just business. It's not personal. And that's a scene that sort of always stays with me as something as kind of like, there'd been so much good stuff in these films prior to that, but that was a sequence, I think, that really unlocked what this film series and what this property could become, would become, ultimately did become. Actually, you know what else it does really well? That sequence is a wonderful example of show, don't tell. The whole series is really, like, to be fair, the whole series is an example of show, don't tell. Like, you keep telling me that John Wick's Baba Yaga and he's the best in the business and he's a guy that you don't want to cross and he's the guy that, geez, we're going up against John Wick and people shudder at his name and, you know, well, show me why. And all the action in these John Wick films shows us why. It just shows us this guy being the absolute best at what he does. And sometimes when he goes up against nameless henchmen, he just wipes the floor with them. And then when he goes up against people with slightly better credentials, it's a bit more of an even fight. But it's another one of those aspects that's so well done. Show me, don't just tell me how good he is, show me how good he is. Show me why all the characters in this world respect him and fear him. Because he's the best at what he does. Very, very good stuff. I think Ballerina's got this really good opportunity as well to show us a different look at it. The trailer kind of hints at this, but the idea that, well, physically, you know, she is smaller, she is going to be weaker. So how does she overcome that in combat? How does she fight differently? And maybe as well, something that like Batman Begins did brilliantly too, way back when, was show us a guy that wasn't quite the finished article. Like, he'll become that guy. Like John Wick, you know, we meet John Wick and he's retired, but he is the guy with this reputation. And in Ballerina, it would be fascinating to see if they establish us with a slightly rougher diamond, with a character who is much more at the beginning of the journey than nearing the end, and therefore is a little bit more vulnerable, is a little less polished. And then as the series grows, we see her become, you know, more clinical, more efficient. So I wonder if Ballerina will tap into that. That's maybe something to keep a bit of an eye on. So I mentioned earlier, you know, Ana de Armas, who was obviously playing the title character in this particular film. I think with her very small role in No Time to Die, the last James Bond film, I think she quite literally turned a lot of heads. She stole the show. And I actually think that until he leaves Cuba, which is obviously the sequence in which he meets Anna's Paloma, I think that so much of that film is great. I think so much of it is excellent. The opening sequence in Matera in Italy is fantastic. The action sequence there. One thing that can't be denied is Ana de Armas was fantastic in her little cameo, and she was quirky and fun, and she was bubbly, and she was physically fantastic in pulling off all the action. The takeaway from a lot of people from No Time to Die was, is there something with this Paloma character? They've spoken a lot about, was it Wei Lin, the character played by Michelle Yeoh in Tomorrow Never Dies. There was Jinx, who was played by Halle Berry in Die Another Day. What is it with the Bond girls from the films which have Die in the title? And then obviously Paloma from No Time to Die. But there's always been this simmering chatter about what more can you do with James Bond? And the irony is, John Wick have done it first. James Bond, they've made 25 odd films. John Wick have made 4 films, and they've figured it out first. If you've got great characters that are side characters that exist and that roam in this world, use them. Do a spin-off. Leverage what you've built into more properties. I suppose that raises questions about where does she exist given that Daniel Craig's character died. I suppose that's probably I've just figured out why they might not have done it, to be fair. But the point stands in that you've got these side characters that you can use if you want to use, if you have the balls to use. They haven't, they don't. Just as I wait to try not to get run over. They've got all these great characters that they've established over time and never ever use. And in John Wick, they've sort of gone, geez, yeah, she was pretty good in that. Is there something in that we can use, we can spin off into our own thing? And they have, and they've acted before Bond have. And I think John Wick have realised that, well, we've got this thing that's pretty good and it's been received really, really well. It'd be silly, it'd be stupid of us just to let it die. It'd be nuts. And the longer we wait to do something with it, well, the quicker it dies, because it just loses its luster, it fades from the public eye, fades from people's memories. And then all of a sudden, you know, the generation that maybe is loyal to it forgets about it, moves on from it, doesn't care about it anymore. So it is interesting that, yeah, John Wick, 4 films into its run, have decided to pull the trigger on a spin-off. James Bond is now, geez, what are they? 62 years into its run, and they're sort of scratching around wondering what to do next with the character and how to relaunch it. You know, it's why films like Mission Impossible and John Wick have gone past it, because they're just more cutting edge and they take more risks and they do all the stuff that Bond used to do better, and in some cases first. So that's about it. Had a decent enough ride, covered a bit of ground, done a bit of a loop. If anyone's familiar with the area, they probably need to reseal that. It's bumpy. But no, I had a good ride, covered a fair bit of ground down here. If anyone's familiar with the area, you probably notice I've done a little bit of a loop. But those are just some overarching thoughts on John Wick and Ballerina and where it all sits and where it maybe goes and what the series has done right, and, you know, hopefully some reasons to be excited about what the series is doing and where it might go. And yeah, so as I said earlier, if you've liked this, like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. You're looking forward to it. What do you like about John Wick? What are your impressions of it? Have you watched the trailer? Blah, 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 all that stuff. But yeah, if you've enjoyed it, let me know. Let me know some thoughts about formatting. Maybe let me know some thoughts about presentation, because the way I present this is really just a first crack at it. It'll surely evolve over time as I figure out different methods and different approaches and the like. I'm going to change gear earlier as I approach this hill. But no, thank you so much for your time. Follow, like, subscribe, all that. We'll catch you in the next one. It's a clunky gear change. Ugh. Ugh, come on, mate. It feels a little bit better. All right, leave me to struggle to get back up this hill and get home.